Greetings, empowered investors. I am coming to you today from Belgrade, Serbia. That is country number 97 for me, 97 countries. There's a website I've heard about called the Century Club, where once you get to over 100 countries, you can be a member. So I got to check that one out and see if I should join it. But in these travels, I definitely learn a lot of things about economics, about investing, and most specifically about that big issue that most of the world is facing severe challenges with. And that is none other than the thing I've been talking about for 21 years. That is inflation, of course, the I word. And I was in Turkey just a few days ago, and I snapped a picture of this menu where I went and had a wonderful Turkish coffee. And look at this menu. They have stickers over all of the prices, but not just one sticker, many stickers, because inflation has happened so egregiously and so quickly in that country. During its worst point, inflation just in the last 2.5 years or so reported to be 55 to 83% in a year, in a 1 year period there. Can you imagine living in such awful, awful inflation? And so the menus all had these changeable prices. Some were written in with a marker, some were stickers, and some you just thought, well, those are the prices for tourists and not the locals. Yes, of course, there is that scam we all hopefully know about. By the way, yesterday here in Serbia, a taxi driver tried to scam me, but I wasn't having it. And I tell you, whenever you go and travel around, or even if you're not traveling around, you're in your own home place, do not let people scam you. Remember that all of your actions or inactions, as the case may be, are a license for that business or that person or that, and I'm going to pick on a particular type of business, that property manager. If you let them take advantage of you, you are letting them take advantage of the next person and the next person and the next person. Because if someone doesn't stand up and call them out, then you're not doing any favors for the next person. You're certainly not doing any favors for yourself, but look at it as a charitable activity, calling these weasels and rip-off artists and con artists and scumbags. You got to call them out. You got to do your part to end the cycle. And by the way, maybe we'll touch on a few political things in this show today, because, wow, what an environment we are living in nowadays. We are just witnessing the decay of the West. And it is happening. The Western world that was the greatness of the human race over the past couple thousand years, or at least since the Renaissance, past few hundred years, right? The Western world is just in decline. It's so sad to see it. It really is. But anyway, we'll get to that in a moment. But here is a chart from Statista, and it says inflation has come down. Now they're talking about the United States here. Inflation has come down, but high prices are here to stay. Cumulative versus year-over-year change in consumer prices in the US since January of 2020. So we're seeing COVID-era stuff here mostly, and the cumulative change in prices represented by the dark line, is that a blue line? I think it is, by the dark blue line, versus inflation year over year represented by the red line. Well, now they're getting to claim at least partial victory over the battle with inflation, saying it is only about 3%. And in reality, we all know it's massively understated in three major ways: weighting, substitution, and hedonic indexing. I've taught you about that many times over the years, so we don't have to go into it now. but it's understated. Everyone would have to agree that the CPI is nothing more than the CP lie. It is a scam. It's understated. There are many reasons the government wants to understate that and make us believe inflation is lower than it really is. So let's just make the assumption that when they tell us the inflation rate is 3%, we're going to assume it's at a minimum 50% higher than what they tell us. That would bring it to 4.5%. And if we think it's worse than that, if we think it's maybe double, then we would be facing a real inflation rate of 6%. Many people, by the way, think those two statements I just made would be considered very conservative versus reality. And look, everybody's got a different personal inflation rate because if you're paying rent, if you're paying mortgage rate based on owner's equivalent rent, the way the CPI calculates it, or just increased mortgage rates, I mean, that's inflation, right? Yes, they say they're raising the rates to battle inflation, and that is true. But the increased rates, if you're buying a house or financing anything for that matter, those increased rates, the cost of money virtually tripling, depending on what you're looking at, that's inflation, right? You're really living with that real inflation. Not to mention healthcare. I was reading an article that we posted actually many years ago during the Obamacare debate. Of course, Nancy Pelosi, we've got to pass the bill to see what's in it, right? So think about how much worse healthcare has gotten since Obamacare. I mean, it is absolutely pathetic how awful it is now in terms of the price you're paying, right? So if I look at my health insurance premiums, they are easily up by nearly 100% since Obamacare, almost double, right? Now, look, to be fair, I've gotten a little older. So naturally, your health insurance gets more expensive as you age, and your healthcare costs should be expected to be higher as you age. Now, that's not really the case in my case, but in general, I think that's a fair way to look at it. But it's not that the cost has almost doubled. It's the fact that the coverage is so much worse than it has ever been in my lifetime. My deductibles used to be $1,000 a year in terms of healthcare deductibles. Now, I think it's $8,800. So really, this is not covering healthcare anymore. It's only covering something catastrophic. And in terms of copays and included doctor visits and all of that kind of stuff, it's just so much worse than it's ever been. It's awful. It's an absolute disaster. If you're paying tuition for college, that's become just a complete ripoff. These universities are called hedge funds. That's what they really are. And so, look, the cumulative inflation here, according to this particular survey, is basically 21% since January of 2020. Okay, well, what if you had $1 million in mortgage debt? Say in 2020, you financed 4 properties and you thought, Jason, I love your inflation-induced debt destruction strategy. That is a fantastic strategy to game the system, to beat the elites at their own game, to beat the banksters, to beat Wall Street, to beat the government, to beat the Federal Reserve and all of the other central banks in the world. We want to use inflation-induced debt destruction. That is the best plan. And so say you bought into that, as many of you did. I know, because you're our clients. And you got $1 million in mortgage debt in January of 2020. Well, regardless of what's happened to your property since then, now, of course, we all know they've gone up in value massively. Rents have massively increased, so your income is much higher. Yeah, your expenses got a little higher too, because, hey, as property owners, we're not immune from inflation in terms of our cost of repairs and things like that. That gets a little higher, but it's nothing in the overall scheme of things, right? Because you basically got on that $1 million in debt that you control against your maybe 4 properties, right? You basically got a $210,000 inflation payoff because that's been the cumulative official rate of inflation since January of 2020. Well, as we talked about a moment ago, what if you believe, rightfully so? I mean, you don't even have to like go far out on a limb to believe this, that the CPI understates the inflation rate. Well, what if that inflation rate is 50% higher? Then you've had over 30% inflation. And gosh, that's not hard to believe at all, is it? I mean, look, we all experience these inflation rates in our own life. If you've had over 30%, let's just call it 32% inflation since January of 2020, well, your property's gone up in value, your income has gone way up in rents, your tax breaks have been fantastic, but inflation has paid off $320,000 of your mortgage debt. If you started at 1 million in nominal dollars, well, they were real dollars when you borrowed them, but they're now called nominal dollars, right? But the real debt, you nominally might still owe $1 million, right? Assuming you've hardly paid any principal down on that mortgage, or I should say your tenants have hardly paid any principal down. But inflation has paid off $320,000. Okay, what if you believe, as I was talking about a moment ago, that the real inflation rate, whatever the CPI tells you, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, if it tells you it's 3%, then it's really double. So say the cumulative inflation rate has been, let's just call it 40%. That means inflation paid off, inflation-induced debt destruction, $400,000. Okay, that's a little over 4 years. That's $100,000 a year increase in your return on investment. I mean, imagine the difference that makes in your life. Well, all of the doomers and gloomers are sitting here thinking about, well, real estate prices are going to crash. Yeah, well, someday you'll be right, just like the broken clock that's right twice a day, sure. But they ain't crashing yet. And they haven't so far. And there's still a massive housing shortage. So inflation is benefiting you in huge, huge, wonderful ways. All right. This was a really interesting, well done video that got almost 50 million views on X, which, by the way, I got to tell you, thank you, Elon Musk. I am really liking X more and more. I have never been very active on Twitter in the old days. I had an account for a long time. You know, I had at the peak like over 40,000 followers, which, you know, is not that big a deal in that world. And I never paid much attention to it. But more and more nowadays, I am using X for reliable information because the mainstream media has just completely lost credibility. And all of the disgusting big tech companies that are just censoring like crazy. Like last week, they censored one of my YouTube videos and took it down. I mean, there's no real appeal process. They don't give any reason. These disgusting criminal scumbags that are running these companies really should be indicted for crimes against humanity. What they are doing is awful. The biggest problem facing the human race, as I've always said, is censorship. That is the most dangerous things. I mean, Fahrenheit 451, Ray Bradbury's book. I mean, look at what the Nazis did. I mean, every tyrant throughout history, what they seek to do first is control the information. And it's pretty scary stuff. Okay, so this video is from Dr. Peter Onge. Is that how you say that? He says 76% of all personal income tax last month went to servicing the $34 trillion national debt. How did we get here? Two men, FDR and Richard Nixon. Well, Nixon's the one who took us off the gold standard, put the final blow on it, right? Together, they broke the dollar and put the American people into debt slavery. Now, this is terrible news for most people. But for us, because we are using inflation-induced debt destruction, this benefits us. And I'm going to talk to you about the 6 ways very specifically it benefits us in just a moment. Let's take a look at what he has to say.
Last month, interest on the national debt ate up 76% of income tax, meaning 3 out of every $4 you currently give the IRS are actually going to China or Wall Street.
So why are they going to China or Wall Street? Well, Wall Street, because basically they fund the debt and make money off all the debt, and, such a complex concept, right? Wall Street, obviously the banksters are always making the money. But China, because China is the holder of about $1 trillion of her debt.
Colleague E.J. Antoni, who sources directly from the Office of Management and Budget. They report that for the month of June, the U.S. government collected $185 billion in individual income taxes, and it spent $140 billion on debt interest. So 3 out of every $4 straight out the back door.
3 of every $4 just to service the debt. Can you imagine? This is where the whole system, we are on the verge of where the whole system just goes upside down. Like, you'd call it a pyramid scheme, but it's like an inverted pyramid scheme. It's just unbelievable.
Us noticed, adding, quote, "I'm glad 76% of the income tax I pay goes directly to important things like interest on past government incompetence. On an annual basis, that's up 8 points in a single year. And if it keeps up, the federal government will be paying more in debt interest than it collects in income tax in, about 6 years and 9 months. What's driving all this is that income taxes are actually down, which normally only happens in a recession, while the cost to service the national debt has exploded by 33% in a single year, thanks to trillion-dollar deficits and rising debt costs. Put them together, and in the past 12 months, Washington paid $868 billion in interest alone, on track to hit $1,140 billion in the coming year. For perspective, in George W.'s first year, the entire federal deficit was $158 billion. Now we're paying 5 times that in debt interest alone, and next year we'll be paying 7 times.
I mean, empowered investors, the math is truly shocking here. We can be assured that it leads to one thing: more and more inflationary pressure. And you know how to benefit from that.
For even worse perspective, if the federal government actually tried to live within its means, it would have to cut nearly $2 trillion in annual spending, which would mean a 50% cut to everything outside Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid. Yes, even the military and those top men at Homeland Security. Sadly, 50% cuts are not on the table, meaning it will get worse. For perspective, it took precisely 192 years for Washington to accumulate its first trillion in national debt. It took us just 100 days to add the last trillion.
Did you hear that? So I've talked to you about this before, that we are adding that $1 trillion every 100 days. So at the current burn rate, and it is a burn rate if there ever was one, 3.65 trillion with a T dollars per year just in interest. That's what we're adding to the debt. I mean, this is absolutely shocking how quickly we are now adding to the debt.
Here, 2 men, FDR and Richard Nixon, followed by 50 years of politicians with less willpower than a Wall Street banker at a strip club. So FDR broke the gold backing of the dollar back in 1933, and Nixon finished it off by banning foreign countries exchanging dollars for gold. This meant the Fed could print unlimited amounts of money, meaning it could finance unlimited federal deficits, which is what it did. To illustrate, when FDR took office, the accumulated federal debt since 1789 was just $22 billion. After FDR, that exploded 20-fold by Nixon, and then it exploded nearly 100 times to today's $35 trillion. So what's next? Brought to you by Unchained.com. We are not getting 50% spending cuts absent a civilization-ending crisis, meaning the only realistic solution is to go back the way we came, limit the money printing. In theory, of course, Washington could just do this using, say, Milton Friedman's so-called K% rule. But given the incentives to buy elections and reward donors, Washington needs the physical constraint of hard money backing. This could mean backing with gold, as is traditional. It could mean Bitcoin someday. It could even mean a basket of commodities like oil or grain, which would be an improvement. Alas, given hard backing is not remotely on the political radar, we are in for a lot more debt and a lot more inflation.
A lot more debt and a lot more inflation, ladies and gentlemen. That is the future, and you've got to defend yourself against it. And the best way to defend yourself against that is with income property using inflation-induced debt destruction. Because remember, it's the most debt-favored asset class in America. And there are 6 ways that the government could try, and it is trying kind of all of these at once to get out of the mess. They could default on the promises, right? Just lessen the promises to save money. Again, politically unpopular. We saw what happens when austerity measures are instituted. We saw what happened years ago in Greece. We see what's happening in France, which, well, let's not even get into the Paris thing yet. Unbelievable. They could raise taxes. There's just not enough tax to get. I mean, the government takes in just over $4 trillion a year in tax. The problem is way too big for tax increases. It just won't even make a dent in it. A yard sale. We could sell off assets. Years ago, we all heard about them talking about selling ports to Dubai. Our country has sadly sold our very unique, very powerful military technologies to many countries and despots that it shouldn't have sold them to, but hey, it needs the money, right? Well, they could steal resources from other countries. I just watched the Napoleon, well, I wouldn't call it a documentary, but movie the other night in, I don't know where I was. Oh, I think I was on the cruise ship in Greece when I watched it. And, you know, Napoleon was basically a fantastic general, fantastic thief. He was a robber. Okay. And he had a military that he used to do the robberies, right? To accumulate assets. That's the way the world map was written, okay, is through wars and, AKA theft, right? It's nothing new. Technological innovation, this is the positive side, and this is happening. These are all happening concurrently, really. And then the most likely scenario, the best business plan for governments and central banks to simply inflate their way out of the debt. So how do you benefit by all this? Well, you use inflation-induced debt destruction with your income properties, and that is how you have a big benefit. Well, since I'm traveling and going to all of these different places around Europe, it would really be remiss not to talk about the absolute craziness of our world right now, the Olympics. I mean, this is truly unbelievable. Right in the ceremony, besides all the stuff everybody's talking about, right? Which, by the way, is not necessarily a depiction of the Last Supper. Just so you know, look up Dionysus Festival. Look that up on Wikipedia. And I think that depiction, that, offensive depiction, was really a blending of the two. It wasn't really the Last Supper exactly. Okay, so just look that up so you're not just believing what everybody says at first blush, right? So there's a little more to it than that. But nonetheless, it's just absolute craziness. I mean, the elites are out in front. They have become so emboldened with their, their Satan worship, their radicalism, this sort of George Soros-esque plan to change the world. There are so many cross currents and so many factors and so many things kind of blended together in this amalgam of just absolute nuttiness. Okay. But look at this, the golden calf at the Olympic ceremony. I mean, this is just unbelievable. Just look up the significance, if you don't know that, of the golden calf, right? The worship of the golden calf. It's absolutely crazy. We are witnessing the massive intentional attack and decline of the Western world on so many fronts. I mean, think about what happened in just the past couple of weeks. We had an attempted assassination on a former president and now again presidential candidate who shouldn't even have to be running because the whole last election was just a complete scam. We all know that. Okay. I mean, anybody with any ounce of true thinking knows that things just don't add up. I mean, there's the 2000 Mules documentary. Be sure you watch that if you haven't already. Of course, that was censored. Of course, so many things about C-19 were censored and J6 were censored. It's absolutely ridiculous. And, you know, they love to say, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist. Well, again, this meme, I want to show it to you again. Conspiracy theorist, nothing but a derogatory term for a person who researches a subject, then uses logic and critical thinking to form an educated opinion instead of just blindly believing whatever they saw on their television. Shouldn't you say that the people that just believe whatever's in the media, they're the conspiracy theorist, right? It's just become beyond the beyond, folks. It really has. Before we wrap it up, be sure to join us for our next Wednesday Zoom meeting. You're going to like this one. We have got a totally new person to the network, JJ Childers, who is going to talk about asset protection and tax planning. And I think you're really going to enjoy this next one coming up on August 14th. So go register, jasonhartman.com/Wednesday for our next upcoming masterclass. These are free, jasonhartman.com/Wednesday. And Empowered Investor Pro members, I want to remind you of our new time for our monthly meetings. We meet the first Tuesday of every month, the pro members, and we've got a new time for that. It's now 12 noon Pacific. You've requested this, 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern for Empowered Investor Pro on the first Tuesday. And then the second Wednesday is our masterclass open to all our listeners and viewers of the Empowered Investor Network. And you can register for that one at jasonhartman.com/Wednesday. Until next show, I'll see you in 2 days where I will probably be in a different country. Reach out if you need us. Our investment counselors are available through jasonhartman.com or at 1-800-HARTMAN. And happy investing.